So I'm going to show you an example of a table that is not in first normal form. Okay, so for instance, looking at the table on the top, is this table in first normal form? No, it is not. Because you stored multiple values, for example, multiple course title, multiple course ID, and so on, in the same cell, right? And so this is not in one. How can we address that? I'm going to your question shortly. So when you have multiple values stored in a cell, so you either store it this way, which is not correct because then it violates the atomicity, right? Or you say, okay, let's, for example, if this is 1, 2, 3, and this is 4, 5, 6, I'm going to store it like this. And you write one phone number here, for example, and the other phone number here. Okay. So, but this still has problems, right? We got rid of storing multiple values in one cell, but now we have the problem with duplicated rows, right? Because this is for the same student, right? And our primary key, which is a student number, will be repeated. So that's also not possible. So that table on the top is not 1NF because it stores multiple values in the set. That's all you have to know about 1NF. About 2NF, we say a table is in 2NF if it already is in 1NF plus no partial dependency. So what do we mean by partial dependency? So for all types of dependency that we discuss in this class, you always check the primary keys, okay? So you see when you want to identify the type of dependency, it depends. Is it between like the non-key column and a primary key column, or is it between, for example, just all non-primary key columns that define whether it's partial or transitive? So now let's talk about partial dependency. What is that? Anyone? What was partial dependency? Yep.
It's like a belt, a row with a halfly depends. It's not directly related to the primary key. So, like if there's a student number, there's a course code, and a course price. So course price isn't fully dependent on the student number. Like student number, it's just related to the course code.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
So, what's partial dependency? When you have a column or columns in your table that are partially dependent on your primary key, or they depend on only part of your primary key, okay? So let's say you have a composite primary key. And what is a composite primary key? A primary key that includes more than one column or attribute, right? Sometimes in your table, none of like the columns that you have can uniquely identify a row, but together they can. For instance, if you have so let's say you have a student ID, right? You have also course ID or course code, and then you have a student name and grade. So we want to identify the functional dependencies here. So first of all, a student ID could be, I don't know, 1. A student name could be Mona. A student ID and the course could be 3, 4, 2, 1. A student ID could be 1, again, the same student, right? Another course, 3, 4, all 1. Now, let's say you have another student with the same course. And this is Alex. And this is my grade. And so on. Is this table in first normal form? Yes, it is. Because we don't have duplicated values. Is this table, they are all atomic. Is this table in 2NF? It is not in 2NF because it has partial dependency. So in order to identify partial dependency, let's identify what are the functional dependencies here, which columns depend on each other. First of all, in all tables, all columns depend on the primary key, which means the primary key column can uniquely identify all of them. And that doesn't cause any problem, right? That's a full dependency and it's okay. But sometimes we have a situation like this where there is a column, a student name, that depends on only part of your primary key. So what is the primary key here? Is the student ID primary key? No, because it is repeated, right? Is course ID your primary key? Again, no, because course is also repeated, right? How about the combination of a student and course? In this table, yes, right? Assuming that we're talking about a specific semester and each student is enrolled in each course only once. And if this is our current table, yes. So in this case, we say a student ID, right, can uniquely identify a student name, or a student name is dependent on a student ID, and a student ID is not your whole primary key, it's part of your primary key, right? Your primary key is this. So whenever you have a column that depends on only part of your primary key, not the whole primary key, is when you have a partial dependence, right? So if I give you a table in the exam, when you have a single primary key, which means your primary key is only one column, can you have a partial dependency? No, there is no way, right? Partial dependency is when you have a composite primary key and there is a column dependent on only part of your primary key. Yeah.
So to make this table 2NF, would we just remove student name?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about how to normalize it also shortly. So first, let's identify the functional dependencies here, right? So we could identify the the partial dependency as well.
So for example, like if we have a table normalized to 1NF, and there is no partial dependency, everything is
if it is already 1NF and there is no partial dependency, so it is already also in 2NF.
Like for example, if we have a table,
What do you mean by duplicated?
like the relation which is not even one, right? They have to give
Like the one here in the slide.
yeah.
Okay.
And then we change it to like 1NF,
Mm-hmm.
then there is no partial dependency. So we directly move to 3.
You have to check case by case. For instance, here, this table is not in 1NF, right? And we show how to avoid that, right? And step by step, like if you also check the other slides, right? So, for example, for this one, you can either, you have like these repeated groups here. So this is not in 1NF. Now we separated this into two tables, one with the student ID, name, address, major. So this is all student information, right? And another table we put all other information, right? So we only separated a student information.
So I got the question. My question is this: if this like a scenario is that you change the table to 1NF, and then you don't need to change it to 2NF because you move to 3. There is no, for example, there is only one primary key, and then it's possible.
Yeah, it's possible that you won't have a partial dependency. Yeah. Yeah, maybe you only had a student ID, course ID, and grade, but you had duplicated values, but then you don't have partial dependency. Yeah, you always have to check, like, I mean, this is not something I tell you to like memorize for all tables. There is no like single rule, right? You have to know you have to understand the dependencies, and then you can easily identify the normal forms. The same way that I do here, I can do for any table. So you are the same, right? So for instance, here, look at these two tables. So the table on the right here, right? So a student ID and course ID together are the primary key. So we have a composite primary key. Is this table in 1NF? The one on the bottom right. Is this table in 1NF?
Yes.
Yes, 1NF. They are all atomic. We don't have multiple values stored in one set. Is it in 2NF? Do we have composite primary key? Yes. So we have to check. So if you have a single primary key, don't even bother yourself to check for partial dependency. You don't have, right? But if you have composite primary key, if we have composite primary key, can I say we always have partial dependency? No, we may or may not. If this table was like this, right? If this table was a student ID, course ID, and grade, it was already in 2NF and also in 3NF, right? Because this table now has a composite primary key but doesn't have partial dependency. Because it doesn't have partial dependency, so it is in 2NF, right? And the table in the slide here, it's not in 2NF, right? Because you have a composite primary key and you have partial dependency. Can you tell me what is the partial dependency here? Course title, depending only on course ID, right? Course title doesn't depend on a student ID. What do I mean by dependency? When I say course ID doesn't depend on a student ID, it means having a student ID, you cannot identify the course. Let's say my student ID is 1, and I enrolled in 10 courses. Having my student ID, can you identify the course? No. I may enroll in multiple courses. It cannot be uniquely identified. But now let's say course ID and course title. If I tell you 3421, can you tell me what is the name of the course? Of course you can, right? Because course ID or course code is a unique identifier for the course name. It can uniquely identify a course name. So this table is not in 2NF. Is it in 3NF? Immediately no. If a table is not in 2NF, cannot be in 3NF. Even if there is no transitive dependency, we have there. But even if there is no transitive dependency alone, it doesn't matter. So for a table to be in 3NF, it should be in 2NF, right? Which means it's already also in 1NF, right? Plus no transitive dependency. Plus no transitive dependency. Now, what is a transitive dependency? What is transitive dependency? Yeah. One column depending on another.
One depends on another, and that one depends on another.
Yeah, non-key columns, right?
Yeah.
So when non-key columns depend on each other. So for instance, do we have a transitive dependency? So transitive dependency is the dependency between non-key columns. By non-key, I mean non-primary key, okay? So the column might be foreign key, it doesn't matter. We are interested in primary key because dependency is all about uniquely identifying other columns, right? And that's not about foreign key. That's the job of primary key, right? So we are interested, when I'm asking you about functional dependencies, always check your primary keys and see if it is composite or not. If it is not composite, and the table is already 1NF, they are all atomic values, then you're easily saying the table is already in 2NF, right? So 1NF is easy. No multiple values in the cell 1NF. 2NF also easy. If it is single primary key, easy. right? If it is composite primary key, then you have to check if there is dependency between some of the columns with part of your primary key, not the whole primary key. For instance, this table. Is this table, I said this table is in 3NF. Now let's say why there is no partial dependency here. Grade is not dependent on course ID alone, right? And grade is not dependent on the student ID alone. Because if I give you a course ID, let's say 3421, can you uniquely identify a grade? No. 3421, does it uniquely identify the grade? No. One is 90, one is 78, so it doesn't uniquely identify it. Now, having a student ID, can we uniquely identify the grade? Again, no. One, like the same student can like have different grades for different courses. So grade, what is the dependency here? Can you identify the dependency?
Grade is dependent on both of the primary keys.
Grade dependent on both course ID and student ID, right? Because having a student ID and course ID, then you can definitely tell me what is the grade, right? So in that case, it's a full key dependency. And full key dependency doesn't violate any normal form. That's absolutely fine, okay? Yeah.
So I have a question. So if there's you don't have composite key in it, but
We don't have, sorry?
you don't have a composite key in it,
Yeah.
you have transitive dependencies. How would that work? Can we say it is in 2NF at that point?
No, it is not in 3NF.
Oh no, can we say at that point it's in 2NF? There's no composite key, but there is transitive dependency.
If there is no composite primary key, so you cannot have a column depending on only part of your primary key, right? Because the primary key doesn't have parts, it's just one part, right? So either there is a dependency, which will be on the whole primary key, right? Or there is no dependency, which is again fine. So your table is in 2NF already if you have a single column primary key, right?
Also, like in two examples I saw when there was no primary key, for example, like teacher ID, we would make a primary key teacher ID separately and then add it to the table. So in that case, is that okay? Because that's just us trying to make the table which.
What is your table?
Coming back to my previous question, there's no composite key, so it's already in 2NF, but there are some things that we can optimize still. Like for example, we can have teacher ID. Yeah, and so in that case,
I understand. My question is, what is the table? For example, are you talking about teacher ID in a teacher table?
Oh no, course table.
Course table. Okay.
Yeah. So in that case, can we have like? Is that the way we go to a 3NF, and that's how we can call it a 3NF?
Yeah. Is it similar to this? So we have like instructor name, right? Let's say we also have instructor ID, doesn't matter. So now look at this table here, that the one in the bottom right, okay? So this table. Now we have student ID, course ID as your primary key, so you have to look for partial dependency, right? And there exists a partial dependency. What is that? Course ID depends on only the course title only depends on the course ID. So there is a partial dependency. So the table is not in 2NF, right? Now let's say I'm removing the course title from this table, okay? So now we have a student ID, course ID, instructor ID or name, doesn't matter, instructor location and grade. What would be the normal form of that table? And I think we have that. No, we don't have. Okay, so imagine we don't have the course title here. So let's say we have only a student ID, course ID, and instructor ID, instructor name, instructor location, and grade. Okay? So, what is the normal form of this table? So let's say a student ID is 1, course ID is 3421, instructor ID is, I don't know, 1000. and the same student taking another course with the same instructor, and then we have another student in the same course and same instructor, same student, different course, different instructor, and this is Mona, and this is this is last one. No, this is business. Okay, so now let's talk about this one. What is your primary key here? Can a student ID alone uniquely identify its role? No. Course ID? No. Instructor ID? No. Now, how about a student ID and course ID? In this table, yes, right? So, let's say this is your primary, composite primary, right? So, first of all, is this table in 1NF? 1NF. Why not? Repetition of what? We don't have like two exact row repeated, right? It's different courses for 01, right? Anyone? Yes?
It isn't one of
Yeah, it isn't 1NF. We are not storing multiple values in a single cell. Now, how about 2NF? Is it in second normal form? What do you check for 2NF? Partial dependency. What do you check for partial dependency? Composite primary key, or your primary key in general. Do you have composite primary key? Yes. If yes, check for partial dependency. So it always is primary key. Is primary key single? Right? If yes, no partial dependency. If no, if this is not single primary key, it's composite primary key, then you have to make it. So, this table is not in 2NF. Is it in 2NF or not? So, what is your partial dependency here? So, is
that's transitive.
yeah?
I think it's instructor ID and course ID.
Okay. Okay, so if you say each course can have a unique instructor, okay, so if that is your assumption, and let's say, for example, my assumption is that 3421 doesn't have different sections, so don't think about how things work at York University, okay? Because at York we have different sections. I may teach same course, or the same course can be taught by only me or multiple instructors, right? For example, I may teach 3421 section N, another instructor teaching 3421 section N, but we're still teaching the same course, right? That's not the case here. Now, assuming that each course can be taught by only one instructor, okay? So, if that's the case, is this in 2NF? Yeah?
No, because we're in course ID, instructor ID.
Yeah, this is instructor ID, this is course ID.
And then instructor name and then location all be in one table.
Okay, so I would like you to just separate two things together. When we're talking about dependency between non-key columns, non-primary key columns, it's about transitive dependency, not partial, okay? So don't overwhelm yourself with different things at the same time. Always go step by step. So we check 1NF and it is in 1NF. We check 2NF, right? We should check partial dependency. For partial dependency, you check for primary key, right? Composite primary key. Do we have composite primary key? Yes. Should I check for partial dependency? Yes. If my assumption is that each course can be taught by only one instructor, can I say course ID can uniquely identify students? Yes. Is it a partial dependency? Yes. Right? So in this case, there is a partial dependency, so the table is not in 2NF and it is not in 3NF. Now assume that we don't have instructor ID, or if this was not partial dependency, or we have it. Now talk about 3NF, transitive dependency. So what one of you actually suggested you guess? The dependency between instructor name and instructor ID in this table, what kind of dependency is between instructor name and ID? Transitive, right? Because instructor ID here is a foreign key, not primary key. And this dependency is between two non-key columns. Because instructor name depends on instructor ID, which is not a primary key in this table, okay? So in this case, this is a transitive dependency. The same is for location, right? Instructor location depends on instructor name and ID because each instructor has a specific office, has a specific location. So instructor name or instructor ID can uniquely identify instructor location. Yes?
If a course had multiple instructors, would it not have a partial key dependency? If a course had multiple instructors, we still have a partial key dependency.
So here, if we have the same course with different instructors, depends. If you mean like course have different sections, so in that case you also have to choose your primary because here a student ID, course ID will not be your primary, right? So if we have a section here, right? Let's say we have also a student ID, course ID, or maybe here, let's put it course section. Section. And this would be section N, this would be section N, right? Again, all depends on your assumption. If you assume that even if the course has different sections, still it should have the same instructor, it will remain the same, right? The dependencies remain the same. But if you assume that the same course can be taught with different instructors, like this, then you have to also change the time, right? Because now, the student ID and course ID does not uniquely identify even the instructor name. And then you either go with surrogate key, right? Add the surrogate key, or you go with like this. Okay, let me check the time. We have to start. Sorry. Hi. Oh, thanks.